Hello and welcome to Mental Health Hour. My first time streaming live, and I'm not one for the cameras, so let's see how this goes. Remember, be kind and compassionate with me as I get used to all this streaming and live broadcasting. It's quite a leap for me. I am a behind the scenes type of person. Really excited to be spending this next hour with you, listeners from around the globe. Always love to hear from you. We have a number of questions and comments that I'll be reading as we progress. But before I go too far, remember that this mental health hour is for educational and information purposes. Please seek professional help from someone licensed, from someone capable, from someone with the right training and information to help you with whatever you might be going through. Okay, and to reach us, you can text or call 437-778-3299, 437-778-3299, or email infolovebay@gmail.com, info, love, L-U-V, bay@gmail.com. It's been a bit of a weird week here in Canada. Our clocks change twice a year. People say we gained an hour, but it has an impact. It has an impact, and no matter how long you've been living here, you just never get used to this daylight savings, I'll say, drama. So if you're here in Canada, I hope you're enjoying the extra hour, though it's not really every day has 24 hours. So I'm still trying to figure out as an immigrant why we say it's an extra hour when we don't go from 24 to 25. It's still always 24 hours. Anyway, let's get into our questions. Last week, we started talking about triggers. And like I said, as the holiday season is approaching, a lot of people are triggered by the season itself. Maybe you're not a festive person, you don't like the holidays, you don't like Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever you might celebrate around December, January. Maybe it's a sad time because it reminds you of your loss. I mentioned a friend of mine whose dad passed away, and so will be the first Christmas without him. And it's going to be hard for a lot of people. And so I decided, let's talk about triggers. Let's talk about triggers. Let's prepare ourselves for those of us who are triggered by the holidays, meeting up with friends. Sometimes it's relatives we have beef with and issues with. And because it's a family gathering, we just have to be there. And the whole time we're anxious, we're just waiting for that uncle or aunt or cousin or whoever to say the wrong thing, and we know they'll trigger us because they do that every year. And so we're not really looking forward to the holidays for whatever reason. We do know that the holidays can be a triggering time for people. And I want us to think about it, to be prepared for it. So before I get into the letters, and we have quite a few that have responded to our new topic on triggers and have questions and want to share some of their own experiences of being triggered. So as a reminder, a trigger is a feeling, a memory, a reaction that is spontaneous. It's not planned. Your body doesn't build up to it. Your mind doesn't build up to it. Something happens and immediately it stimulates a response from you. And I use the example of using a gun, right? Like once you pull the trigger, you can't take the ammunition back. And it's like that with the triggers that we're talking about. So it can be a feeling, it can be a memory, it can be a smell, it can be a word, it can be an action, it can be a place or a space, it can be almost anything that brings you back to a traumatic moment or circumstance in your life. It is automatic, it is spontaneous. You don't experience something today and then and then the trigger hits 2 weeks later. That's not a trigger. Triggers happen that fast. So we often don't feel like we have control over our triggers, especially if we're unaware of them. So triggers are trauma reminders. They remind us of some trauma that we've experienced. Our body reacts, our emotions react, our minds react. It's out of our control. And in the past, I've talked about the difference between feelings and emotions. And if you recall, emotions are things that happen quickly. Someone says something, you immediately get angry or upset or anxious or hurt or happy as well. Emotions are similar to triggers in that they are spontaneous. It's not like you plan, when my dad says this, then I will feel sad and I'll feel happy and my body will react. You don't plan emotions. Same way with triggers, you don't plan them. They are a response to some external stimuli, right? So feelings, on the other hand, are emotions. And if you recall, emotions don't last that long. Think about the last joke I heard. I always use this example. The last joke you heard, you didn't laugh for 24 hours straight. You laughed when you heard it. That laughter is an expression of that emotion, whether it's amusement or joy or whatever it is, but it doesn't last even for 2 minutes. You don't laugh for 2 minutes nonstop. The reason why you keep laughing is because now there's thoughts attached to that stimuli, to that joke. And so 3 days later, you'll think about it and you will chuckle and you will laugh. 3 minutes later, you will think about it and you will chuckle or laugh. But emotions themselves last very, very few seconds. What seems to prolong them are the thoughts we attach to them. And that's what we call feelings. So think of feelings as thoughts plus emotions equals feelings, right? Triggers are like emotions. What ends up making that trigger, the response to that trigger last, are the thoughts, the actions that we then attach to them. So remember, a trigger, we have no control, we don't plan, we don't think about it like, oh, she just said this, now let me get triggered. No, it doesn't work that way. So, what and how you respond to the trigger may prolong it. So there's that automatic, spontaneous response to stimuli, but then you, as a conscious being, then attach something to that, and that prolongs the impact or effects of that trigger. So, for example, people who have anxiety, you experience something that triggers that panic attack. We actually often tell people, when you have a panic attack, don't fight it. Because when you fight it, you end up prolonging it because it's a spontaneous reaction. If you let it run its course, it lasts a shorter time. But the more you try and control it and stifle it and stop it and fight it and all of that, feeling of panic continues because of that loss of control. But if you let it run its course, it actually lasts a shorter time. And sometimes that's the way it is with triggers. if we try and control our response after it has happened, sometimes it can make it worse. Okay? So, a trigger is that thing, that memory, smell, sound, uh, thing that you see, that you taste, that whatever it is, that produces an automatic, spontaneous response in your body and reminds you of a traumatic experience. It brings you back to some trauma that you suffered, that you experienced. We know a lot about triggers from studying military personnel that have been on the front lines in wars. Right now, we know Ukraine and Russia have been at war for a while. And now we have the situation in Gaza and Hamas. And we're seeing some of, like the other day, I was on LinkedIn, and I'm not able to sit and watch a lot of these videos, but as I was scrolling, I was actually looking for something specific. There was a video of some kids that were trembling um, after they barely escaped an onslaught in the Middle East. And these little bodies were shaking. So, you can see from the way their bodies are reacting that they've experienced some trauma. And those children, without the right help and support, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, might still be triggered in a way that brings them back to things that they've experienced in this day and age in their lives. So triggers can actually bring you back decades to a traumatic experience. Sometimes, as a way of protecting the mind, it forgets, it erases traumatic events or experiences. But that doesn't mean it's absolutely gone, right? And then one day you're walking along and something triggers you and it reminds you, it brings back something that had been buried deep inside. And we call that burying repression, right? In psychoanalysis, we call that repression. When your mind, as a way of defending itself, pushes something so far back in your memory, you can't access it easily. This is why, if sometimes you're having dreams you can't explain, sometimes you're being triggered and you don't understand why. And I said this last week, some of us are not even conscious of our triggers or the trauma that is being triggered, right? And so that's why it's important to seek professional help. Okay, so before I go too far, let me start with the first email that we have here. Um, we have Aisha, who's in Abuja. And Aisha says, what really causes triggers and how do people overcome them, especially the emotional ones? So triggers are linked to trauma. They're linked to an experience that emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally scars us, harms us, traumatizes us in some way. So triggers are reminders of a traumatic experience. And this is different from, for example, you write something in your journal and then 2 years later you're reading your journal and it reminds you of the trauma. That's not necessarily a trigger, because here you have gone in search of that information. You know what you wrote in your journal. It might be that you forgot some details, but we would not necessarily call that a trigger. Why? Because you are actively seeking out that information, and perhaps you've already prepared yourself for it. A trigger is something, like I said, you pull the trigger on a gun, the ammunition shoots out. It's spontaneous, it's uncontrollable, it is a response, an automatic response. So when you open your journal and start reading, that's not an automatic response. That's you going into your past, consciously aware, likely knowing that, oh my goodness, if I read this, I used to have a young person I used to work with, and she liked journaling, and she had been journaling for years. And she would prepare herself because she knew every time she goes into her journals, she's going to become very emotional and very sad. So sometimes she'd even have the comfort food ready, and she'll open her journal and the chocolate and ice cream or whatever is already there. That's not a trigger. That's planned, that is conscious, that is purposeful, going back into your past. A trigger is not something that you curate that way, okay? So, what causes triggers? Trauma causes triggers. Trauma causes triggers, and triggers trigger our trauma. It's almost like a vicious circle, right? How do people overcome triggers? We'll get to that, especially emotional ones. So, Aisha, I hope you're here. I hope you're listening. And we're going to keep unpacking triggers and traumas over the next few weeks so that by the time everywhere is festive and decorated and Christmas lights are up and holiday symbols are up, and you'll be able to withstand any triggers you might experience. Okay. All right. So that was one from Abuja. Thank you, Nigeria, for listening. Edinburgh. So now we're in Scotland. Okay. And Nana in Scotland says, I notice a shift in my emotions when my ex husband and his current wife drop off the kids on his weekends. I become emotionally upset and stay silent. This is unfair to our kids. I know there's a trigger there. I'm trying to overcome it, but it is extremely difficult. How does one get through this? Okay, so is this really a trigger? Since I read this, I like honestly, Nana, I've been trying to. I don't think you are triggered per se. And triggering is one of those words that, especially with the woke people, with the woke folk. Now, I have nothing, no issues with woke people. A lot of people would say I'm woke for one reason or another. But sometimes with woke people, we use certain terms that we take from psychology and criminology and science and this, and we make them part of our everyday language, and in so doing we erase the meaning of that word. Trigger is one of those. I hear people talking all the time about being triggered, and I'm looking at them like, yeah. So Nana, I don't think you're triggered, I think you're bitter. Bitterness is not the same. Perhaps you're still hurt. Perhaps you still have resentment. You might be bitter. You might be regretful. I think you need to explore other emotions around this, but I would not necessarily label it as a trigger. Like every week he comes, I'm triggered. Is it spontaneous? Is it automatic? Does it bring you back to some trauma? Maybe you need to give me a little more information, because you're not sounding triggered. You're sounding like a woman scorned. I don't know what happened with you and your ex husband. Dude has moved on, he has another woman. Maybe you need to as well. And maybe if you do, you won't feel triggered. But I honestly would not file this under trigger. Perhaps I'm wrong, but based on the information you've given me, you become emotionally upset and stay silent. every weekend that he comes by with his ex-wife to drop off your kids, that's not a trigger. That's more like a pattern of behavior. And the best way, and I think we've talked about this in the past, patterns, emotional regulation and patterns of behaviors and how we respond to certain things the same way over and over again. Find a point and change the script. So, Nana in Edinburgh, I don't think you're triggered. I think explore the emotions, do the work, get over it, move on with your life, and stop attaching negative emotions that bring you down. And you've said it yourself, it's unfair to your kids. And I don't know how old your kids are, but as they grow older, they will start to notice this. And you don't want to burden your children with guilt because they're trying to have a relationship with their dad. Okay? So, Nana in Edinburgh, I would not label what you have described as a trigger. I would label it as a pattern, and you need to address it. You need to address it. You need to get over it, move on. And for the sake of your children, emotional regulation is important. Work on that. Okay? All right. We have Karen from St. Lucia. What are the parities between mood swings and triggers? Very, very good question. Very good question. And she's asking for more information around this. Okay. So a mood swing can also be attached to triggers. Sometimes you're walking along, you're happy. And I said this even last week, and maybe you're on the bus or on the subway and you smell something, and that smell triggers you and brings you back to a certain person, time, experience, trauma. But even that can happen at an unconscious level. You might not be aware enough to realize that, oh, I just smelled brute. If you grew up like me in Africa, like a while ago, brute. I think it's a green canister and it's a deodorant spray. And for me, that was something my dad used to use when I was small. And then later I used it as well because I really love that smell because of my dad. But whenever I smell it or something similar, I immediately remember my dad. That's not necessarily a trigger. It does bring him back to mind, but not in a traumatic way. My dad did pass away when I was a teenager. But what comes back to me is not necessarily traumatic. So I would not label it as a trigger. I would label it as a memory, right? So sometimes our mood swings are due to memories. Triggers have an adverse effect, impact. You don't get triggered and then sit down and have a cup of tea stewing over blah, 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 blah. That is a change in mood. So it might be a memory changes your mood. A trigger produces an immediate reaction to trauma. The trauma may not be happening in that moment, but the trigger brings back the same emotions and experience that trauma had on you. So you might start trembling and shaking. There, you know it's a trigger. If you just become sullen and annoyed or emotionally upset and stay silent, that's a change in mood. Even the terminology mood swing, I think that's another thing that we have to be careful about. When you look at diagnostic manuals and why mood swings are important, they are actually used to diagnose certain mental and emotional illnesses. But again, society, because these days we're all educated one way or the other to whatever extent. And so again, we take language from here, there, and there and make it very mainstream. But a mood swing from a purely psychiatric perspective is something where if it's happening enough and you can't control it, and sometimes, and what I mean by you can't control it is you can't just shake it off and say like, okay, I'm just going to shake this off and I'll be fine. I won't feel sad anymore. I won't feel low anymore. And that. So even the term mood swing, we need to attach some critical and important meaning and understanding to it. When you go to a psychiatrist or a doctor, that's one of the questions they ask you. Have you had mood swings? And you need to be able to say yes or no. If your kid, partner, parent, whoever, does something that upsets you, that's not a mood swing. Mood swings are often we don't know why we're feeling that way. We can't exactly just shake it off. And it kind of sits in us for some time. And it takes effort to lift our spirits again, or it takes effort to stop feeling angry or irritable or whatever the mood might be. A trigger brings back a physical reaction to a past trauma. You start to tremble, you start to sweat, you start to cry, you might scream. And as I was saying before, we have come to understand triggers technically and clinically a lot better from studying people that have been at the front lines in war zones, because we see how they're triggered and how their bodies act and how their minds act. When a person is genuinely triggered, it's like that trauma just happened all over again. So feeling emotionally upset and staying silent is not a trigger. It might be a mood swing. But even in that, when they have left, do you then feel okay? I'm fine, not an issue. Him and that woman of his are gone. Now I'm good. That might not necessarily be a mood swing. That might be more about your emotional regulation, learning to control your anger and your upset. So there's a number of things here: mood swings, emotional dysregulation, triggers. Those are different things. And it's usually about how your body, mind, emotions react, and how long it sits in you, and how long you can tolerate it as well. Triggers, I have to tell you, are a lot less tolerable than mood swings. You can be in a foul mood or a bad mood or a low mood or a sad mood for days. You cannot be triggered for days. You would end up definitely in psychiatric care if a trigger has a lasting impact like that. It basically means something in you has broken and you need to be in a hospital. Okay, so we will continue exploring these terms, figuring out what exactly am I moody? That's another thing. Am I moody? Are these mood swings? Or did something trigger me? Or am I just bitter, angry, resentful? Or am I scared, anxious, afraid? Am I sad, grieving? Whatever it is, we need to be able to correctly label it so we can find the right kind of help. Okay? So, Karen, thank you for your question. And we will continue to explore these terms. Okay, so the other two are not necessarily about triggers. So let me stick to the topic of triggers, and then we'll come back to Lorraine in Mississauga and Zena in Toronto. I will definitely read your messages to us. But for now, let's stick to the topic of triggers and trauma. Okay, so I brought up emotional regulation or dysregulation, and that has not yet hit the streets. I don't hear a lot of people use it willy-nilly here and there. So it's still something that I think mainstream and society has not diluted or erased. So what is emotional dysregulation? So it is a symptom. It's a symptom of several different emotional and cognitive states, including mood swings, including triggers, including panic attacks, all of that. So, emotional dysregulation is a symptom, okay? And according to my research, it is something that is often mislabeled. And I think this happens again because we have taken a lot of psychological, psychiatric terms and made them so mainstream that everybody's using them and most people are not using them correctly. Then you end up in your doctor's office and they ask you a question and you answer it based on your understanding of the term. Something that I always do as a therapist when one of my clients starts using some of these terms, I tell them like, no, no, no. In this session, we don't use technical terms because it might mean something different to you than it does to me, and I don't want to assume we're talking about the same thing. So sometimes emotional dysregulation, which is a symptom of several different emotional and cognitive states, can be mislabeled, misconceptualized, generalized in a way that can actually cover or camouflage what is actually going on for a person. Okay, so emotional dysregulation, there is something called emotional dysregulation disorder. And with emotional dysregulation disorder or emotional regulation disorder, emotional instability, personality disorder, emotional dysregulation, if you were listening when we were talking about different personality disorders, it is one of the symptoms of different personality disorders, including borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality types, and others. So you're seeing here that emotional dysregulation has a lot to do with the personality a person presents. So these are those people that they snap easily, they become obsessive about certain things. It becomes part of the personality we perceive in a person, that, oh, that one, you know how she is, you know how he is. Normally when we're talking about a person like that is because we've seen this pattern of emotional dysregulation, and it is a symptom of a personality disorder. Now, what does that have to do with triggers? So people with emotional dysregulation can also have suffered from a trauma that brought on a personality disorder. So, for example, a lot of people with borderline personality disorder likely experience some kind of childhood trauma that has made them unable to tolerate certain conditions, and that also might have triggers. Okay? So, emotional dysregulation is a symptom of a number of personality disorder. It can also be a symptom of some traumatic event. So people that have post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, or post-traumatic stress syndrome are more likely to have emotional dysregulation. They're also likely to experience triggers. So emotional dysregulation comes with uncontrollable emotions when triggered, right? So even though we come to know that that person's like that, if she gets started, she doesn't stop, or if this happens, there's often a trigger associated with that. So when you go to a psychiatrist, they don't just ask, do you have a trigger? They also want to identify and properly label emotional dysregulation. They will ask you a bunch of questions because when it comes to the diagnosing of mental illnesses or mental health issues, it's not as simple as asking one or two questions. You need a complete history. You need certain details and aspects. And that's why I'm saying we need to be careful about the language that we use. You can't just go to a psychiatrist or doctor and say, yeah, I get triggered easily. I hear that so much, so much. I get triggered easily. And I'm looking at that person with compassion, but I'm like, okay. So if you're one of those people that's talking about I get triggered easily, you might want to think about what you're saying. Don't go to your psychiatrist and talk about I get triggered easily. First of all, they might not take you seriously at all. Secondly, they might decide you have some kind of personality disorder. And third, you're likely not giving them accurate information. So if you're one of those people that goes around telling people you get easily triggered, I implore you as a mental health professional to stop doing that. Triggers are real and they're devastating and difficult and challenging. So by talking about I get triggered easily, you are actually minimizing a really, really, really difficult and traumatic experience that a lot of people have to live with. Okay. So that's it with emotional dysregulation. And I'm trying to like unpack things slowly. So if there's questions you have about emotional dysregulation, about triggers and anything else I've described so far, you can text or email 437-778-3299. Email infolovebay@gmail.com. Always welcome your questions. Let's learn together. Let's get ready for the holidays and enjoy them for a change. Okay? So, to summarize, emotional dysregulation refers to the inability of a person to control or regulate their emotional responses to provocative stimuli, not necessarily triggers. Okay, so not necessarily triggers. So going back to that woman who said her husband and his new wife, and she's the ex-wife, there might be some emotional dysregulation there, but not necessarily triggers. If you are finding you can't control your anger, your hurt, your reactions to provocative stimuli, and this I like this term provocative, because sometimes it's somebody needling you, right? They want a reaction out of you because they know if I say this, if I do this, she's going to blow up. I've worked with couples sometimes when they're going through a contentious divorce. Maybe they're at that point where custody, child, what's it called, support, and all of that, the judge is about, and then they start poking and provoking each other, and because they were married, they know exactly which buttons to push to get a rise out of each other so that this person will be declared an unfit parent. It's provocative stimuli, not necessarily a trigger. And the fact that somebody can keep poking you and doing this to you, and you cannot control your reactions, you can't control your emotional responses, means you have problems with emotional regulation, not necessarily triggers. Okay, so there is a difference. Provocative stimuli can trigger you, but is not necessarily a trigger when we're talking about emotional dysregulation. Okay. So let's talk about anger, and we started talking about it last week. Anger as a response to a trigger, right? So there are people who will talk to you about their anger problems. I have anger issues. I have a short temper. I have a hard time controlling my anger. The judge said I need to go for anger management. And I've had some of those clients who end up seeing me because of court mandated anger management. Are those people being triggered? Not necessarily. Maybe. But sometimes it's more about emotional dysregulation than it is about trauma. Remember, triggers in this context, we're not talking about your walking down the street talking about I'm easily triggered. We're talking about real, proper clinical triggers bring an emotional and physical reaction to a past trauma. Some of us, our anger is triggered, but it's got nothing to do with trauma. Sometimes we're just angry people, bitter people, resentful people, unhappy people, and we're around people who remind us of how shitty our lives are, and we're not happy with the way our lives have unfolded. That's not a trigger. Okay, that is not a trigger. There's a thin line between being triggered genuinely and just being angry and hateful about everything people say and do around you. Your spouse says this, you get angry and say, he triggered me. Your child breaks a plate, you smack them and say, she triggered me. Those are not triggers. That's you not being able to control your anger, your temper. That's emotional dysregulation, likely, more likely actually, than it is a trigger. Now, having said that, real, genuine clinical triggers can produce an angry response. Okay? They can produce an angry response, just like sometimes we can get angry about trauma. The trauma we've experienced can bring out anger in us, especially where we feel hopeless, where we feel helpless, where we feel we have no control. Those things can make us angry. They can make us angry because we want control. We want to move on with our lives. We want to forget this trauma, but this thing keeps coming back. We keep getting genuinely triggered, not woke triggered, not personality disorder triggered, but genuinely triggered. And it can be an angry response to trauma. Okay. So you could be angry at a specific person or event, or so what I'm reading here, they give the example of a canceled flight. You've been sitting in the airport and this happens a lot during the holiday seasons, especially here in North America with our snowstorms and this storms and that storms. And you've been sitting in the airport for 8 hours. And the last time you went up to the information desk and angrily demanded an explanation and an ETA. They said, we'll let you know. We think it'll just take a couple more hours. It's been 3 hours now. And then they announce over the system, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to wait another 4 hours. Then you turn around and say, I was triggered. That is not a trigger. That is a reaction to provocative stimuli, but that is not a trigger. Your reaction and anger to sitting in an airport for endless hours, not a trigger. Okay? But if maybe that announcement over the PA system triggers some trauma that happened that is associated with an announcement over a PA system, I don't know, that might trigger a response that might present as anger. Okay, so you can have an angry response to a trigger, but that doesn't mean everything that makes you angry is a trigger. And that's why anger management is important. You need to be able to know the difference, particularly if you are somebody who has experienced trauma. You need to be able to tell the difference between this anger is due to a trigger and be able to know and identify that trigger. And I said this last week, a lot of people don't even know their triggers, but they are triggered because they did experience some traumatic event. And so when you go for therapy, you learn to identify your triggers. You learn to take control as soon as possible, sometimes even preempt and prevent the triggering, because now you have a deeper understanding of the impact of that trauma, right? So you getting angry because you've been sitting around for a while, you getting angry because your ex is posting pictures with their sexy new bae or whatever, that's not being triggered. That is you getting angry. And this is anger you can do something about. Know the difference. Do the work and know the difference. Okay, so I'll leave it there for today around triggers, and I'll go back to the other messages that we got. I'll start with Lorraine in Mississauga. Thank you, Lorraine, for getting in touch. And Lorraine says, hi, Dr. Tapo. It's good to have you back. Thank you. It's good to be back, Lorraine. And Lorraine says, you spoke of self-care, eat, pray, and love. I believe with all the turmoil in the world that we witness, there's so much negativity. It is vital that we add prayer, self-care, self-love in our daily routine. Lorraine, I absolutely agree with you. I myself am a praying woman. But I want to say for those of you who are maybe not religious, there are ways that you still need to connect with your spiritual self, right? And know where you are as a spiritual person. Know what it is that keeps you grounded in the spirit, because every human being, there's that deep inner part of you. And that's the part that when you are listening to the news that some country has been raining missiles on another country and children, women, men, old people are dying, that part in you that feels that pain, even though you're thousands and thousands of miles away, relatively safe, that part of you still needs some care. It still needs some care. It still needs validation as well. Sometimes not believing in deity leads to invalidating that part of ourselves. So even if you don't believe in God or whatever religion, believe in your spirit that it too needs to be validated. It needs to connect and to experience healing and comfort and growth and development and love and all those things as well. And really, that's what prayer is about. And you might be praying to a God, or it might just be, I recently somebody sent me something, and in it they said something about wanting the universe to bring me good things. They were wishing me well. So, whatever language you use, validate your spirit, validate that inner deep part of you, validate it, care for it. And one way you can do that is by connecting with other people and offering pieces of it, bits of it, elements of it, as a way to connect with other people. Some of us have become so cold, so bitter, so resentful, so hopeless even in life, because we have ignored that spiritual self. And that spiritual self needs community, needs family, needs friends, needs validation. It needs prayer, whatever form your prayer might be. So it is important sometimes when you're feeling tired and burnt out and hopeless and all of these things, check in on your spiritual self. How have you been feeding, validating, taking care, sharing your spiritual self with others? Okay. So, Lorraine, thank you for that. We always talk about self-care. We always talk about self-love, and that the importance of caring for others. That in itself feeds us, feeds our spirit. It's part of self-care and self-love. Research actually shows that happy people are generous. They volunteer, they give of their time, they give of their resources, they connect with community and lend a hand and do all of that's the spirit needing to be validated through connection. And we connect by being good and compassionate to other people. Self-love is not selfishness. It's not, I'm going to love myself and forget about you and your needs. And no, that's selfishness. Self-love is knowing what you have to give and then giving it freely. And if you feel that you're depleted and running out, self-care helps you rejuvenate and refill and recharge, so you can go out there and share of yourself with other people. These holiday seasons are the most difficult for a lot of people because of loneliness, because of isolation, because of conflicts. Maybe you had a fight with your mom or your sibling or whatever, and you haven't spoken to them since February. Now Christmas is coming around, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever it is you celebrate, that's rolling around, the New Year's coming up, and you're just feeling horrible because you now have to make the decision. Do I go to the family gathering or not because she's going to be there? And if I go and she's there, do I ignore her? Do I talk? Come on. You know what? We've talked about forgiveness as well. And that is really, really important when we talk about self-love, self-care, when we talk about our spiritual selves. Forgiveness is important. And I want to go back to Nana in Edinburgh. Forgive. Maybe he was the most horrible husband a woman could ever have. Maybe he did the most foul things. There is absolutely nothing he can ever do to earn your forgiveness, so forgive him and move on. I see this post all the time on social media. Forgiveness is about yourself, not the other person. I kind of disagree with that, because sometimes our forgiveness is what makes the difference in a person, to lead them to repentance, to lead them to becoming a better person. If you show a person who doesn't deserve love, they are more likely to change their ways than your hate would basically. So forgive for yourself, but for the other person as well. And if you are a divorced parent and you and your spouse have been divorced for a while, long enough for him to have a current wife, and you're still getting upset, still getting angry, probably still fighting, why did you divorce? You don't divorce to carry on fighting. You divorce so the fighting will stop. So for goodness sake, stop. Stop. Forgive him, forgive yourself, forgive current wife if she's done anything or had anything to do with your divorce, and move on. Move on with a heart that is unburdened with bitterness, resentment, anger, and unforgiveness. And forgiveness is not just a religious thing, it is a very human thing. You may not believe in anything that you can't see and touch, but believe in forgiveness. Because as human beings, that's one thing we cannot earn. Some of us are terrible, terrible people. Terrible. But we still have people who love us, who stand up for us, who show up for us, who forgive us again and again. And we don't deserve it. And we know very, very well that we don't deserve it. So Nana in Edinburgh, like, forgive. Forgive ex-husband and his current wife. Be that woman who opens the door with a smile, invites them in, offers them a drink, has a little chat, and sends them on their way. Because by doing that, you're modeling for your kids something very, very important: forgiveness, compassion, emotional maturity, and how to have a good life. Zina in Toronto says, please address the lens of compassion on your program. Some people have become less tolerant and judgmental of others, and this is so sad. Zina, I hope what I've just been saying answers your request there to address compassion. And the thing about compassion is it starts with ourselves. Often the more intolerant and judgmental people are people who are hard on themselves as well. They think the whole world is judging them, so they go ahead and judge the whole world. They see all their imperfections and assume that's what people are looking at. So they start looking at other people's imperfections as well. Compassion, self-care, self-love, prayer, eat, pray, love, forgive, love, 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 love. Love even the worst of them all. Love. And sometimes that means loving from afar. I tried to love you up close. It didn't work, but I'm not going to exchange that love for hate. I will now love you from a safe distance, and that's okay. But don't ever replace love with hate. Don't ever refuse forgiveness so you can hold on to bitterness and resentment. It'll eat you up. You will grow old very, very quickly. For real. Happy people tend to look young, mostly because they smile a lot, they laugh a lot, and people see them with kindness because they're kind themselves. People are less judgmental too. So that's my message for this week. I will speak to you next week. Get in touch. Take care of yourself. Connect and validate your spirit by connecting with other people with kindness, gentleness, compassion, love, and forgiveness. Good night.